Imagine being trapped in a wooden box at sea for 6 weeks with 30 strangers who can smell everything you do. No walls, no bathroom, no private space of any kind. Sounds like a nightmare. But this was simply Tuesday for a Viking sailor. You picture longships as fast, sleek, almost romantic. Dragon heads slicing through fog, warriors standing tall, wind in their hair. The real answer is far stranger. A Viking longship was not a warship first. It was a floating survival test, and the ocean was only the beginning of what could kill you. Start with the size. Most longships were about 17 to 35 meters long and barely 2 to 5 meters wide. That is roughly the footprint of a school bus, holding 30 to 60 men, their weapons, their food, and their waste. There was no deck cabin, no below-deck sleeping quarters. You sat, rowed, and slept on the same open planks exposed to wind, rain, and freezing spray for the entire journey. Dr. Neil Price, an archaeologist at Uppsala University who has spent decades studying Viking Age life, has described these ships as essentially wooden tents on water. Functional, brutal, nothing wasted on comfort. So how did 60 men survive weeks like this without losing their minds? The answer starts with your body's most overlooked organ, your skin. Vikings didn't have waterproof jackets, they had wool, treated with lanolin, the natural grease still present in unwashed sheep's wool. That grease repelled water just long enough to matter. But here's the part that surprises people. Staying warm wasn't really about staying dry. It was about staying still in groups. On a longship, men slept packed shoulder to shoulder inside sleeping bags made of hide, called sea cloaks by some sources, sharing body heat the same way modern soldiers do in survival situations today. Your body, even now, instinctively seeks shared warmth in cold conditions. That impulse is ancient. The Vikings simply built their entire sleeping system around it. Now picture the smell. No bathroom existed on board. Sailors used a bucket or simply leaned over the side, weather permitting. When the weather didn't permit, you held it, sometimes for hours, sometimes for half a day. Combine that with sweat, wet wool, fish oil used for waterproofing ropes, and unwashed bodies packed into a space the size of a city bus, and you get an environment your modern nose would never tolerate. But theirs did. Why? Because smell tolerance isn't fixed, it's learned. Olfactory adaptation, the process by which your brain literally turns down the volume on a constant smell, would have kicked in within days. The crew likely stopped noticing the stench almost entirely, while a modern visitor would gag instantly. Your brain does this right now in your own home, with smells you no longer notice but a guest would mention immediately. Food was its own quiet battle. There was no fire on board most of the time. Open flame on a wooden ship loaded with tar and rope was a fast way to die, so sailors ate cold, dense, high-calorie foods, dried fish, hard bread called skonrock, butter, and skyr, a thick fermented dairy product still eaten in Iceland today. Fresh water was the real crisis. Barrels of water and weak ale were rationed carefully, because dehydration at sea kills faster than hunger ever could. Researchers studying Norse seafaring, including work referenced by maritime historian Dr. Jan Bill of the University of Oslo's Viking Ship Museum, note that voyages were carefully timed around coastal stops specifically to resupply water, not food. Hunger was tolerable. Thirst was not. Now here's where it gets darker. 60 men, no walls, no privacy, weeks at sea. Tension didn't just happen, it was managed constantly through something almost nobody talks about: ritual insult and structured mockery. Old Norse sagas describe a tradition called flighting, a formalized verbal duel where men would publicly insult each other in front of the crew. It sounds like an outlet for chaos. It was actually the opposite. By channeling aggression into a structured, rule-bound contest, flighting gave men a release valve for frustration without it escalating into actual violence that could tear a crew apart mid-ocean. Modern psychologists studying close-quarters environments like submarine crews and Antarctic research teams have observed the same pattern. Groups that create structured outlets for tension survive isolation better than groups that suppress it entirely. The Vikings didn't have that research. They just had centuries of trial and error and a brutal incentive to get it right. A crew that turned on itself drowned. Sleep itself worked differently than you'd expect. You assume a full night's rest, uninterrupted in a fixed position. The Viking crew didn't have that luxury, and neither did their bodies expect it. Rowing required constant rotation. Men worked in shifts, some pulling oars while others rested, then swapped, hour after hour, day after day. This produced something close to what sleep researchers today call polyphasic sleep, broken into multiple shorter periods rather than one long stretch. Modern studies on sailors, soldiers, and shift workers show the human body can adapt to fragmented sleep schedules. Though performance and mood both suffer over time, the Vikings likely experienced exactly that, a slow, grinding fatigue that built across the voyage, managed only by structure and shared effort. Your own body, after a few bad nights, starts to feel exactly that same fog. Theirs simply lasted for weeks. Then there was the cold itself, which did something to the brain you might not expect. Sustained, mild cold exposure, the kind experienced for hours on an open deck, triggers a stress response in the body. Cortisol rises, focus narrows, minor irritations start to feel larger than they are. This is why historians studying long Norse voyages note frequent mentions in saga literature of short tempers and sudden disputes breaking out over seemingly trivial things, a spilled portion of food, a misplaced piece of gear. The cold wasn't just physically uncomfortable, it was quietly rewiring how the crew processed stress, lowering everyone's threshold for conflict at exactly the moment conflict was most dangerous. This is part of why the structured outlets like flighting mattered so much. They weren't just entertainment, they were damage control for a crew whose nervous systems were already running hot from cold, fatigue, and confinement. There's also the matter of who actually got to go. You might assume any man could simply join a crew. In reality, longship voyages, especially raiding or trading expeditions, often required contributing your own gear, a weapon, sometimes armor, and the physical capability to row for hours without collapsing. This created a quiet filtering system. The weak, the injured, the very young, and the very old rarely made the crew. What remained was a self-selected group of physically capable, socially tested men, which mattered enormously once the voyage began. A crew assembled this way had a head start on cooperation because everyone aboard had already proven just by being there that they could endure hardship. Archaeological evidence backs this up. Skeletal remains recovered from Viking-age burial sites linked to seafaring populations frequently show signs of repetitive strain injury in the shoulders and lower back, consistent with years of rowing, alongside healed fractures suggesting men who had survived previous physical trauma and kept working anyway. Navigation added an entirely different layer of pressure. There was no compass, no GPS. Sailors relied on the position of the sun, the direction of swells, the behavior of birds, and remembered coastlines passed down through oral tradition from earlier voyages. Some researchers have proposed the Vikings may have used a sunstone, a crystal capable of locating the sun's position even through cloud cover, though this remains debated among historians. What's not debated is the psychological weight of navigating without certainty. Every member of that crew was trusting a handful of men with the location of land itself, hundreds of kilometers from sight of any coast. A single navigational mistake didn't mean delay. It meant running out of water in open ocean, with no way to signal for help and no one coming to look for you. That kind of dependency forces a specific kind of trust, the same trust your brain still extends today toward pilots, ship captains, or surgeons. Total reliance on someone else's competence because you have no alternative. So if everything was this harsh, why go? Because the danger of staying home outweighed the danger of the sea. Land in Scandinavia was limited, divided among powerful families, and increasingly impossible to inherit if you weren't the eldest son. The ocean represented something land never could, territory nobody else had claimed. Historian Dr. Kat Jarman, whose research focuses on Viking expansion routes, points to inheritance pressure and population growth as major drivers behind these voyages, alongside trade and raiding. Climbing onto that ship wasn't just adventure. For many men, it was their only realistic shot at land, status, or wealth they could never have at home. Disease moved fast in conditions like these, and the crew knew it. Cuts went unwashed for days, wool stayed damp for weeks. A single case of infected blisters or a stomach illness from spoiled water could spread through 60 men packed into a space with no separation and no isolation. Historians studying Norse expedition records note that illness, not combat, was likely the leading cause of death on many voyages, a detail rarely mentioned in popular depictions of Viking raids. The real threat wasn't always the enemy waiting on shore. Sometimes it was a shared water barrel 3 weeks into the journey. Your immune system today fights battles you never notice quietly in the background. Theirs fought the same battles, except a single loss could end the voyage for everyone aboard. And then eventually, there was the return. You might assume reaching land again felt like instant relief. For many sailors, it likely did. But historians also point to something less obvious: difficulty readjusting to solid ground and ordinary life after weeks of constant motion and confinement. This phenomenon, sometimes called sea legs in its physical form, extends psychologically too. Modern research on isolated expedition crews, including Antarctic researchers and submarine sailors, documents a similar pattern: a strange disorientation upon returning to normal life, a restlessness that doesn't fully fade for days or weeks. The Vikings had no name for this. They simply lived through it repeatedly, voyage after voyage, treating it as an unremarkable cost of the life they'd chosen. Strip away the dragon heads and the legends, and a Viking longship becomes something closer to an experiment in extreme human cooperation. 60 strangers packed into a space smaller than most living rooms, with no walls, no privacy, no fire, and rationed water, somehow built enough trust and structure to row across open ocean and survive. Not through luck. Through systems, shared body heat, adapted senses, rationed calories, and ritualized conflict release, refined over generations because the alternative was death. You live with climate control, soundproof walls, private bathrooms, and food on demand. The Viking sailor had none of that and still found ways to function, cooperate, and endure. So the next time your apartment feels too small or a coworker's habits get under your skin, remember the deck of a longship: 30 strangers, no walls, 6 weeks at sea, and somehow they made it work.